It began with a sound no pilot wanted to hear. The violent rattle of an engine straining far beyond its limits. The deep, tortured growl of metal being pushed to a breaking point high above the Pacific skies. But as strange as it seemed, this noise, this chaos under the cowling wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. American pilots were doing something that defied every rule of aviation. They were deliberately abusing their engines, slamming throttles wide open, running hotter, faster, longer than the manufacturers ever recommended. While their enemies, the Japanese Zero pilots, stared in disbelief at Mustangs. Thunderbolts and Corsairs that just kept climbing, just kept running, even as black smoke poured from their exhausts. The secret was hidden in the numbers. Fuel ratios, manifold pressures, supercharger settings. But behind those cold figures was something far more human. Desperation, innovation, and the sheer will to survive when every second in the sky could mean life or death. The first to discover it weren't engineers or generals, but the pilots themselves, men like Robert S. Johnson and Richard Bong, who realized that if they ignored the manuals and ran their engines hotter than hell, they could squeeze out just enough extra power to escape the enemy's guns or chase a Zero down before it slipped away. In the cockpit, you could smell it. The faint tang of burning oil, the acrid scent of vaporizing fuel. The Mustang's Packard Merlin howling at full boost, its pistons screaming as if begging for mercy. But mercy was a luxury no pilot could afford in 1944. Each mission meant pushing limits, not respecting them. The truth is, this wasn't madness. It was a calculated risk. The U.S. Army Air Forces had learned that every engine had hidden potential, untapped power that could be unleashed if you were willing to sacrifice lifespan for performance. Mechanics called it war emergency power, but pilots called it salvation. Normally, an engine might last 200 flight hours. Under emergency power, it might last 20. But those 20 hours could change the course of a battle. Over the Pacific, when the F-6F Hellcats faced Japanese fighters with better maneuverability, that extra boost, the forbidden setting, allowed them to climb faster, outrun their foes, and dive to safety. In Europe, P-47 Thunderbolt pilots realized they could keep their turbo superchargers spooled up past redline to chase German fighters back to their airfields, even if it meant their engines would seize up minutes after landing. Better to replace an engine than to lose a pilot, one squadron leader said, and that philosophy became doctrine. The factories back home, Pratt & Whitney, Allison, Packard, scrambled to adapt. Engineers rethought metallurgy, lubrication, and cooling to build engines that could take this abuse and still survive. They called it controlled ruin. What's most shocking is how quickly this tactic changed the balance of the skies. Early in the war, Japanese and German aircraft had the edge in agility and endurance. The Zero could turn inside almost any Allied fighter. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could climb like a rocket. But when American pilots began using war emergency power, intentionally overheating, over-revving, and over-pressurizing their engines, the tables turned. Suddenly, those same aircraft that once dominated were now being outrun, outclimbed, and outmaneuvered. Pilots described the feeling as intoxicating. Like flying with the hand of God on your shoulder, one Mustang pilot wrote in his journal. Yet that power came with a terrible cost. Engines burst mid-flight. Pistons fused to cylinders. Radiators exploded. And sometimes, pilots paid the ultimate price when their gamble went too far. But they kept doing it, mission after mission, because they'd rather burn an engine than burn alive. Behind every pilot's desperate decision to redline his plane was an unseen army of mechanics who worked through sleepless nights, covered in oil, rebuilding what the sky had broken. They learned to love the sound of a misfire. It meant the engine had been pushed to its limit in battle. And when they saw a plane taxi back, coughing smoke but still alive, they knew that ruined engine had saved its pilot's life. Soon, engine abuse became standard procedure, not a reckless stunt. The official manuals were quietly revised, limits increased, tolerances stretched, and a new phrase entered the American vocabulary: fly it like you stole it. That was the mindset: take everything the machine can give and then demand more. But how did this strange, dangerous tactic, one that seemed to destroy engines, actually make U.S. fighters twice as effective? That's the mystery that baffled even the engineers. The answer, as we'll see, lies in what the pilots discovered next. That by pushing their engines past the red line, they weren't just flying faster, they were flying farther. Because the very act of abuse unlocked a new kind of efficiency, one the manuals never predicted. And that discovery would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare forever. It sounds impossible. Run an engine hotter, harder, faster than its limits, and somehow your plane flies farther. But that's precisely what American pilots discovered in the skies of Europe and the Pacific in 1944. The moment they began to ignore the rule books, something miraculous happened. Fuel seemed to last longer. Distances stretched further, and missions once thought suicidal became routine. The paradox baffled everyone from flight officers to engineers at Wright Field. How could deliberately abusing an engine, running it at dangerous temperatures and manifold pressures, actually make aircraft more efficient? The answer was buried deep inside the hidden physics of high-performance flight, and in the mindset of a new generation of pilots who refused to obey the limits drawn on their dashboards. In the early years of World War II, pilots were trained to baby their engines. Manuals screamed warnings, "Do not exceed red line." They were told to fly conservatively, to throttle back, stay within safe RPMs, preserve the machinery for the next mission. It made sense in theory, but in practice it cost lives. The Zero would pounce on a P-40 or a Wildcat that hesitated to go full throttle. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s would climb higher, strike first, and vanish before a cautious American pilot could react. But then came the test flights, the desperate dogfights, and the realization that survival meant aggression, not restraint. Pilots learned that by running their engines harder early in flight, they could climb to combat altitude quicker, spend less time burning fuel at inefficient low levels, and enter engagement zones with more control and speed. In other words, the waste of fuel early on saved far more fuel overall. It was efficiency born from boldness. American pilots began experimenting mid-combat, toggling mixture controls, altering boost pressures, and manipulating supercharger stages in ways that engineers never anticipated. A P-51 Mustang pilot might lean his fuel mixture far beyond regulation at cruising altitude, even after running full rich during takeoff and climb, and because his Merlin engine had been broken in by repeated war emergency use, its seals, valves, and pistons expanded perfectly to handle the heat, reducing friction and improving burn efficiency. In essence, the more they abused their engines, the more precisely tuned they became for war. It was as if each aircraft developed its own personality, a living, breathing beast that learned to thrive under stress. Engineers back home began to notice the data trickling in from combat reports. Missions were being flown 20%, 30%, even 50% farther than the charts predicted. A squadron of P-38 Lightnings flew from England to Berlin and back, a mission once thought impossible, after pilots discovered that running slightly hotter actually reduced drag caused by thicker oil and cooler air intake. A technical miracle, but it wasn't in the design. It was in the disobedience. The pilots had created their own field-tested science, a balance between destruction and performance, chaos and control. And from that chaos came an entirely new approach to aerial combat. To the Germans, this was insanity. Luftwaffe intelligence officers interrogated captured American pilots who described running engines beyond reason. The Germans, bound by strict mechanical doctrine, could scarcely believe it. Their precision engines, masterpieces of craftsmanship, were treated with near-religious care. Maintenance intervals were sacred. Overheat a Daimler-Benz DB605 and you risked catastrophic failure. But the Americans had a different philosophy: quantity, adaptability, and fearless experimentation. If an engine failed, there was another waiting. If a plane broke down, a new one was rolled off the line in days. And the pilots trusted their mechanics to rebuild whatever they broke. This brutal efficiency, mechanical courage, you might call it, gave the U.S. Air Forces a psychological and tactical edge that the Axis never matched. And so, missions began to evolve. Pilots didn't just accept that their engines could take punishment. They counted on it. B-17 bomber crews running the engines of flying fortresses to the brink to reach deeper into occupied Europe. P-47s diving at terminal velocity, their turbos screaming, their cylinders glowing red-hot, yet somehow bringing their pilots home. Every mission was a test of nerve, a question of whether man or machine would break first. And time and again, the Americans discovered that if you believed your engine could handle it, it often did. Faith became fuel. But there was something deeper still, a change in engineering culture itself. What started as reckless improvisation began to shape design philosophy. Mechanics returned from the front with notes, scrawled in oil and sweat, suggesting tweaks to carburetors, turbo inlets, and lubrication systems. Engineers listened. They built engines like the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the beating heart of the Thunderbolt and Corsair, to not only endure abuse, but expect it. Its power plant could run on degraded fuel, survive shrapnel hits, and keep spinning with cylinders blown out. It was the mechanical embodiment of American resilience. And by 1945, this philosophy, run it till it breaks, then make it stronger, became the backbone of victory. American planes could now fly deeper into enemy territory, escort bombers all the way to Berlin or Tokyo, and return with range and stamina no Axis plane could match. The irony? The secret to flying farther wasn't conserving energy, it was unleashing it. The pilots who ruined their engines had discovered a paradox that engineers would later formalize: performance tuning through stress. They'd turned war into a laboratory, and their lives into experiments of speed and endurance. When one veteran pilot was asked after the war how he dared to push his Mustang that far beyond redline, he smiled and said, "Because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here to answer that question." War isn't just fought in the skies. It's won in the hangars, under the wings, and beneath the roaring engines that refuse to quit. While American pilots were pushing their machines to the edge of destruction, there was an invisible army working tirelessly on the ground to make sure those same engines would start again tomorrow. They were the grease-stained magicians, the ground crews, the mechanics who took the word abuse as a challenge. To them, the roaring complaints of a tortured Merlin or a blistering R2800 weren't signs of failure. They were signs of power being fully used, fully realized. And somewhere between the roar of the engine and the grit of the wrench, they discovered a secret. When you understand how a machine breaks, you also understand how to make it indestructible. These men worked without glory. No medals, no headlines, no victory parades, yet every sortie, every dogfight, every miraculous return on one sputtering engine was written in their hands. They learned to read engines like doctors read heartbeats. A vibration could tell them about imbalance in the crankshaft. A smell of oil meant a cracked seal in the upper block. A shift in tone, that subtle metallic hum beneath the growl, meant a cylinder was misfiring or running lean. There were no sensors, no computers, no diagnostics. Their tools were intuition, experience, and the unrelenting rhythm of war. When pilots came back from missions with overheated engines, glowing manifolds and cracked plugs, most mechanics didn't complain. They grinned. Because every failure was a lesson. They were building a library of knowledge, one engine at a time, across thousands of airfields from England to New Guinea. And that's where America's edge grew sharper. Unlike their German counterparts, who were trained to follow meticulous factory-prescribed maintenance schedules, American ground crews were encouraged to improvise. If something worked, write it down. If it didn't, try again tomorrow. They learned to modify carburetors for better altitude fuel flow, adjust turbocharger linkages to allow faster boost response, and even reroute coolant hoses for improved temperature distribution. The manuals said don't. They said, why not? In one famous case, a Mustang squadron in Italy began reporting dramatically improved range and reliability. Investigators found the secret. Their crew chief had begun deliberately running engines at slightly higher oil temperatures during warm-up, thinning the oil just enough to reduce drag in flight. The result? Each plane could fly nearly 50 miles farther on the same fuel load. It was a tiny, seemingly reckless tweak, but multiplied across hundreds of missions, it became a strategic weapon. Stories like this spread quietly among units, whispered over coffee, written in chalk on hangar walls. The wisdom of war was spreading laterally, mechanic to mechanic, not top-down from the engineers. And the engineers noticed. Back at Wright Field and at the Pratt & Whitney plants, reports began pouring in. They read about engines that had exceeded rated hours twofold without failure. They saw that abused engines often returned with cleaner combustion patterns, fewer carbon deposits, and tighter seals, paradoxical proof that running them harder improved efficiency. Mechanics had essentially discovered the early principles of dynamic stress conditioning, a process modern engineers now call heat cycling. The battlefield had become an engineering lab, but it wasn't just about the machines, it was about the men. Ground crews became part of the soul of each squadron. Pilots trusted them with their lives. Before every mission, a ritual played out. The pilot would touch the cowling, look at his crew chief, and nod. No words needed, because both knew. If that engine quit up there, it wasn't the pilot who'd failed. It was the man with the wrench down here, and that bond, forged in heat, oil, and sleepless nights, became as vital as any weapon. On airfields across England, you could hear the same sound after every mission, the hiss of coolant, the rattle of tools, the clank of cowling panels coming off, mechanics crawling over wings, inspecting spark plugs under dim lanterns, wiping oil from their eyes with fuel-stained rags, the smell of burnt metal mixed with coffee and fear. They worked through nights under blackout conditions, engines still hot enough to burn their hands. But they didn't care, because they knew every adjustment mattered. Every spark plug cleaned meant another pilot might make it home. Every fuel line replaced meant another bomber would reach Berlin. When historians later examined how American aircraft maintained such overwhelming sortie rates compared to Axis powers, the answer wasn't just mass production. It was adaptability. U.S. ground crews could tear down and rebuild an engine in a fraction of the time their enemies required. Parts were interchangeable, standardized, designed to be replaced rather than worshipped. German and Japanese aircraft, though masterpieces of engineering, were fragile divas, complex, temperamental, intolerant of field repair. But the American approach? Brutally practical. As one mechanic quipped, "If it fits and flies, it's fine." By 1945, this mechanics culture had spread into the design rooms themselves. Engineers no longer designed engines for perfection. They designed them for forgiveness, for the human hand, for the man in the mud with a wrench and a cigarette fixing miracles at midnight. The R-2800 became famous not just for its power, but for how easy it was to keep alive. Its parts could be swapped in the field, its tolerances generous, its systems self-contained. That philosophy, simplicity, adaptability, and resilience would go on to shape every generation of American aircraft that followed. The pilots got the glory. The planes got the fame, but the truth, the secret heartbeat of air power, pulsed beneath the wings, in the sweat and stubbornness of the mechanics who turned engine abuse into art. And when victory finally came, they didn't cheer. They just cleaned their hands, looked at their engines, and whispered, "You did good, old girl." When World War II forced American pilots to abuse their engines just to survive, something far deeper than a combat tactic was born, an entire cultural shift in how machines were designed, built, and trusted. What began as battlefield improvisation became the foundation of a new philosophy. Build it strong enough to break, then make it stronger. This idea, forged in the smoke and oil of airfields across the globe, became the heartbeat of what engineers would later call over-engineering, designing machines not merely to function, but to thrive under punishment. And the spark for that movement came directly from the skies. The stories came flooding back after the war, P-47 Thunderbolts limping home with entire cylinders shot out, P-51s running on fumes and still hitting 400 mph, B-17s flying back to England with holes big enough to walk through. And behind every miracle return was a simple, terrifying truth. These planes weren't supposed to survive that kind of punishment. Yet they did. The data from the battlefield was undeniable. The machines that were overbuilt, the ones with margin, forgiveness, and redundancy, had outlasted everything else. And that realization changed the entire trajectory of American industry. At first, engineers didn't quite understand it. Before the war, most design philosophy followed efficiency: shave off weight, reduce cost, optimize performance. But the war threw efficiency out the window. A machine that failed efficiently was worthless. A machine that survived chaos, that could still function in a hurricane of heat, debris, and shrapnel, was priceless. Aircraft like the Corsair and the B-17 became case studies in endurance engineering. They could fly with half their systems crippled, keep fighting, and somehow make it home. And so, when the war ended, the lesson carried back into every factory, every lab, every drafting table in America: don't design for the perfect world. Design for the broken one. Young engineers returning from the front, the men who'd once been pilots, mechanics, and field testers, filled American companies with new blood and new thinking. They joined General Electric, Boeing, North American Aviation, Ford, and Chrysler. And wherever they went, they brought war's brutal wisdom: simplicity, reliability, redundancy. They had seen too many overcomplicated machines die for lack of a single part. They'd learned that a component that could tolerate heat, vibration, and misuse wasn't a luxury, it was survival. This philosophy became baked into post-war design, from cars to turbines to early computers. The idea of military grade wasn't marketing. It was the legacy of engines that had been tortured and refused to die. Take the R-2800 Double Wasp, for example. It had become the gold standard of survivable design. 18 cylinders, twin-row radial layout, air-cooled, with redundant ignition and lubrication systems. Engineers studying its field performance after the war were stunned. Even when abused, run hot, overboosted, low on oil, it kept functioning. It wasn't pretty, but it was unstoppable. That same resilience became the DNA for civilian aircraft engines, industrial machinery, even car engines like the Chrysler Hemi and the Chevrolet Small Block. America's entire mechanical culture began to echo the lessons of wartime endurance. And with this new philosophy came something else: freedom for the pilot, and by extension, freedom for the user. Over-engineering wasn't just about durability, it was about confidence. When a pilot knew his machine could take punishment, he flew differently. He took risks. He pushed limits. And those risks often paid off. The same principle applied in peacetime. When a driver trusted his car's brakes, he drove faster. When a test pilot trusted his jet's structure, he dared to break speed records. The confidence born from over-engineering created an entire generation of risk-takers who fueled the jet age, the space race, and beyond. But this approach also came with a paradox. Over-engineering meant weight, cost, and complexity. It was an expensive philosophy. But in the American psyche, fresh from a war where reliability meant life or death, it didn't matter. What mattered was trust, and that trust became the invisible currency of innovation. When you knew something could take abuse and still perform, you didn't fear the edge. You sought it. It's why America's Cold War aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, the B-52 Stratofortress, and the SR-71 Blackbird inherited the same spirit. They were all born from the DNA of wartime endurance, machines built to survive their own power. In the design offices of Pratt & Whitney and North American Aviation, engineers began to apply abuse testing as a formal procedure. They deliberately push engines past their rated limits, observing failure points, recording heat thresholds, and discovering how metal fatigue progressed under stress. What pilots had once done instinctively in combat, leaning mixtures, redlining RPMs, overboosting manifolds, became a science. The data was no longer anecdotal. It was quantifiable. They realized that engines conditioned through stress often performed better in normal use, echoing the very lesson of the war: resilience through punishment. And perhaps the most poetic part? The machines taught the men as much as the men taught the machines. Engineers learned humility. They learned that you could calculate perfection on paper, but real life would break it in ways you never imagined. They learned to listen to the world of vibration, friction, and heat, the language of stress. And through that, American engineering matured into something uniquely human, a partnership between logic and chaos, between design and defiance. By the 1950s, the fruits of this philosophy were everywhere. Jet engines that could run for hundreds of hours without overhaul, cars that could cross continents, industrial turbines that powered cities. Even household appliances carried echoes of wartime reliability. The American reputation for machines that just work, from Fords to Frigidaires, was no accident. It was the cultural residue of war-born endurance. The lesson learned when pilots abused their engines and mechanics refused to give up. And so, in a strange circular way, the chaos of war birthed the calm of reliability. The abuse became the blessing. The punishment became progress. And the machines that once screamed in agony above Europe and the Pacific laid the foundation for a nation that would dominate the skies, the roads, and eventually the stars. The final truth: every roar of an overboosted Mustang engine in 1944 was an echo of the future, a promise whispered in smoke and fire. Build it strong enough to suffer, and it will never truly die. By the middle of 1944, the war in the skies had become something far more than a contest of machines. It was a test of will, of instinct, and of nerve. The official flight manuals, with their neat diagrams and red-line warnings, were no longer the law. The battlefield had rewritten them. The men in the cockpits, young, exhausted, and often only half-trained, had turned flying into something visceral, almost primal. They discovered that victory didn't belong to the cautious or the obedient. It belonged to those who had the guts to defy the limits. And nowhere was that defiance more vivid than in how American pilots treated their engines. By the book, a P-51 Mustangs Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was rated for a certain manifold pressure, a certain RPM range, and specific mixture settings at each altitude. But the book was written for peacetime, for test ranges, for safety, for theory. War had no patience for theory. In combat, a single second of hesitation could mean a burst of cannon fire through your canopy. So when a pilot felt a Messerschmitt diving in from above, he didn't think about manifold pressure. He slammed the throttle to the wall, pushed the mixture full rich, and prayed the engine wouldn't explode. And often, miraculously, it didn't. That's when the realization spread like wildfire through the ranks. These engines could take it. The red line wasn't a wall, it was a suggestion. Mechanics began whispering to their pilots, "You can give her a bit more." Pilots began comparing notes. "I ran her at 72 inches last sortie." Didn't blow. Before long, squadrons had their own unofficial settings, secret recipes for power that ignored every regulation. The air war became a massive, uncontrolled experiment in controlled chaos. One Mustang ace, James "Slick" Lambert, was known for pushing his Merlin past its rated limit every single mission. "If she's not screaming, she's not fighting," he joked. He once described how he'd intentionally overboost during climb just to scare the Germans off his tail. His crew chief would shake his head after every mission, wiping oil off the cowling, muttering, "You're gonna kill her one day." But she never died. The more Lambert abused her, the smoother she ran. That's when everyone realized something profound. These machines were alive in a way no one had expected. The shift wasn't just technical. It was psychological. The pilot's relationship with his aircraft transformed. The plane stopped being a fragile piece of machinery and became a living partner, one that responded to trust, courage, and instinct. Pilots began to feel, not calculate, their way through combat. They'd sense when to push, when to ease off, when to let the engine cool. It was a dance between man and machine, a partnership built not on obedience but on intuition. The great pilots weren't the ones who followed procedure. They were the ones who listened. And this culture of flying by feel spread across every front. In the Pacific, Corsair pilots learned to abuse their massive R-2800 engines to yank their planes out of impossible dives. In Europe, Thunderbolt pilots discovered that running slightly overboosted at altitude gave them just enough edge to chase down a fleeing Focke-Wulf. Even bomber crews began experimenting, leaning out mixtures, changing prop pitch, playing with fuel load balance mid-mission to eke out a few more miles. The war was being fought as much with instinct as with bullets. Of course, this new style of flying came with a price. Many engines did fail. Many pilots did die testing the limits. But each failure fed the growing pool of knowledge. Each melted piston, each seized supercharger, each cracked cylinder head was a lesson. Engineers back home studied every failed engine that returned from combat, dissecting it like a corpse, trying to understand why it lasted as long as it did, and why it finally gave out. Every scar told a story, every failure became a new data point. The manuals slowly changed, quietly, without announcement. Maximum safe limits were revised upward. Operational guidelines were relaxed. What had once been considered reckless became standard practice. This was how war accelerated progress, not through committees and calculations, but through desperation and courage. The pilots' willingness to break rules didn't just save lives. It rewrote the future of aviation. They proved that engines could be pushed harder, airframes could endure more stress, and pilots themselves could master instinct faster than any instructor could teach. And then came the real shock, when engineers realized that many of the engines ruined by pilots actually came back in better condition. Metallurgists discovered that stress cycling had hardened key components. Valve seats sealed tighter, bearings wore smoother, pistons burned cleaner. The act of abuse, paradoxically, had improved the engines. It was as if the machines had evolved under pressure, like living organisms adapting to a harsher world. The pilots had unknowingly turned their cockpits into evolutionary crucibles. Even the Luftwaffe took notice. Captured German pilots were stunned at how recklessly Americans treated their aircraft, and even more stunned that those aircraft survived it. One German ace reportedly said, "We fly our engines as if they are made of glass. The Americans fly theirs as if they are made of iron." He wasn't wrong. The cultural difference was total. Precision versus adaptability, caution versus courage. And that difference, not technology, was what decided the air war's outcome. By late 1944, it was official. American pilots were flying farther, faster, and longer than anyone thought possible. Mission planners began extending ranges, stretching fuel loads, and sending bombers deeper into enemy territory because they now trusted what the pilots already knew, that these abused machines could take it. What started as rule-breaking became doctrine. What began as defiance became policy. And in the quiet after the war, when many of those pilots became test pilots, airline captains, or even engineers themselves, they carried that same fire into the next generation of flight. They taught their apprentices not to fear the red line, but to understand it, to question, to test, to feel. And because of that, jet fighters, rockets, and even space capsules were designed with that same philosophy: to endure, to adapt, to survive chaos. It began as madness, an act of desperation in the thin blue air over Europe, and it ended as revelation. The idea that pilots could abuse their engines to fly twice as far wasn't just an accident. It became a deliberate, disciplined kind of chaos. By the time 1945 rolled around, the U.S. had transformed the art of destroying an engine into the science of discovering its true potential. Every time a pilot twisted the throttle beyond regulation, something new was learned, something the engineers back home could never have found on the test bench. Picture a pilot, alone at 25,000 feet, the horizon washed in cold silver. His P-47 Thunderbolt is groaning, oil temperature rising, the supercharger whining like a banshee. He knows he's passed every safe limit. 75 inches of manifold pressure, 3,000 RPM, the kind of settings that would get him court-martialed if anyone saw the gauge. But the Luftwaffe isn't playing by the rules either. He pushes harder, watching the needle quiver in the red. Smoke curls. Metal sings. The plane doesn't explode, it endures. And in that moment, the impossible happens. His range extends, his climb holds, and his target falls. That defiance, that need to win, changed aviation forever. Back on the ground, the engineers couldn't believe it. When the pilot landed, they expected to find a ruined engine, a pile of molten metal. But what they saw shocked them. The cylinder heads were stressed but intact. The pistons showed signs of self-polishing. The crankshaft bearings, instead of being scoured to death, were smoother than factory spec. The abuse had somehow made the engine better. It was a contradiction that broke every law of mechanical theory and opened the door to a revolution in metallurgy, lubrication, and thermodynamics. See, those pilots had accidentally discovered the power of overstress endurance. Every time an engine was pushed past its limit, it underwent microscopic changes. Metals hardened, oil films adapted, carbon layers reformed. These weren't failures. They were evolutions. Mechanics began referring to it as seasoning the engine, a kind of ritualized punishment that made it stronger for the next fight. It wasn't science at first. It was intuition, experience, and a hint of superstition. But when engineers at Wright Field began running stress tests based on field reports, they confirmed it. Controlled overloads increased performance. The effect was so dramatic that General Electric and Pratt and Whitney began deliberately testing engines under combat conditions. They'd run them until the oil smoked, until the turbochargers glowed cherry red, until bolts loosened from heat expansion, and then they'd rebuild them. Measure the tolerances and discover that the engines had adapted. War had turned maintenance into experimentation. Each squadron became a flying laboratory. This revelation rippled through the entire military-industrial complex. Air commanders, who once punished engine abuse, now encouraged it within limits. They called it field innovation. Maintenance crews began keeping secret notebooks of their pilots' throttle habits, mapping which settings yielded the best range or acceleration. One squadron in the 8th Air Force even charted their engine personalities, knowing which Mustangs ran smoother after being broken in by aggressive flying. Pilots started naming their planes not after women or loved ones, but after temperamental gods of fire and metal, Vulcan, Hephaestus, Prometheus, because they understood now that these machines weren't fragile, they were forged. And the proof came when missions began stretching farther than anyone thought possible. What used to be a 500-mile combat radius became 800. Fuel efficiency improved because pilots learned how to manipulate boost and mixture with finesse, finding sweet spots no test manual could predict. Engineers back home tried to replicate those results. They couldn't. The only way to discover those invisible performance gains was to live it, to feel it, to risk breaking it. That's when the Air Force began to formalize the idea of flight envelope expansion. Instead of setting hard limits, they began creating dynamic envelopes, performance ranges that could shift depending on conditions, pilot skill, and mission needs. It was the birth of modern test flying, born not in laboratories but in dogfights. Every ruined engine was a data point that expanded human understanding of what machines could do. And this new philosophy, pushing until failure, then learning from the failure, didn't stop with propellers. It became the foundation of jet research. When Chuck Yeager later broke the sound barrier in 1947, the principles he relied on came straight from those reckless W-2 pilots. He knew that to find the next frontier, you had to go past the red line. The ghosts of the Mustang pilots were in the cockpit with him. But it wasn't just about hardware. This culture of defiance changed people. It bred a generation of aviators who saw limits as invitations, not boundaries. They weren't reckless. They were deliberate. They treated risk as data. They learned to listen not to the gauges, but to the feel, the vibration through the stick, the tremor in the seat, the strain of the sound. That intuition became the secret weapon of American aviation. It was the reason U.S. test pilots would later dominate the space race, because they'd been trained by the sky itself. And yet, what made this story so incredible was its irony. The same Air Force that had once punished pilots for ruining engines eventually celebrated them for it. The same manufacturers who had scolded. Squadrons for voiding warranties began advertising that their engines could take punishment and deliver victory. The transformation was total. Even decades later, Retired Way-2 pilots would look back and laugh. "We weren't engineers," one said. "We were just scared kids trying to survive. But we figured out that if you treat the machine like a partner instead of a rule book, she'll take care of you." That spirit, reckless, fearless, intuitive, became the DNA of American aviation. It wasn't precision that won the skies. It was the willingness to break everything to find out what really worked.